There is a moment no one warns you about, not the moment of loss, not the moment of grief. Those come later, and at least they arrive with a name, with a shape you can hold in both hands and say, this is what hurts. The moment, I mean, is quieter, more unsettling. It is the moment after you get exactly what you wanted. You know this moment. You've lived it. Maybe you've never spoken it aloud, because something about it feels like a confession, like it reveals something embarrassing about the machinery inside you. But you know it. The job you spent 3 years working toward, the person you finally had, the apartment, the recognition, the arrival, the thing that was supposed to change the quality of your days, the texture of your waking up in the morning. You got it. And then nothing, not nothing dramatically, not a collapse, just a faint settling, a quiet that wasn't peace, a kind of atmospheric deflation, as if someone had let a little air out of something you didn't know was holding its breath. You looked at the thing you'd wanted, and it looked back at you, neutral, present, real. And somehow, in its realness, it had already lost whatever it was that made you want it so ferociously in the first place. The wanting, you noticed, was gone, and without the wanting, so was a certain kind of aliveness. This is where Lacan begins, not with theory, not with diagrams. With this, the oldest human complaint, the one that lives below language, below pride, below the careful story we tell about what we want and why. The complaint that says, I got what I needed and it wasn't enough. I arrived where I was going and the place felt wrong. I loved someone completely and still felt somewhere alone. Lacan doesn't look at this and say, you wanted the wrong thing. He doesn't say, try harder, want better, choose more wisely. He says something stranger, more difficult, more in the end, more liberating than any advice. He says, this is not a failure, it is a structure. You were not built to be satisfied, not as a flaw, not as a wound, not as something that could be corrected if you meditated enough or loved more maturely, or chose your objects of desire with greater wisdom. You were built inside language, inside selfhood, inside the very act of becoming a person, with a gap at the center, a constitutive absence, a missing piece that was not lost along the way, but was installed at the beginning, the very foundation on which your desire was constructed. The hunger is not a symptom. The hunger is the architecture. Jacques Lacan, French psychoanalyst, provocateur, the most difficult thinker in the tradition of Freud, possibly in the whole of 20th century philosophy, spent his life mapping this, not to cure it. He was suspicious of the very idea of cure, suspicious of any psychology that promised to fill the gap, to make you whole, to deliver you to some sunlit meadow of fulfilled desire where you would finally lastly be at rest. He thought the promise of fullness was itself the problem. He thought, and this will take us the full length of this journey to understand, that what you want is not the object of your desire. What you want is the wanting itself, the movement toward, the luminous, aching forward lean of a soul that has not yet arrived, and the arrival always is the end of that. So let us begin here, in the deflation, in the quiet that follows getting what you wanted. In the moment you should have been happy and weren't quite, and didn't know what that meant about you. It doesn't mean you're broken, it means you're human. It means desire is doing exactly what desire does. And by the time we reach the end of this, by the time we've walked through the mirror and the word and the object that shines with impossible light, through the pleasure that bleeds into pain, through the face of the one you loved and what you were really looking for there, you may not be satisfied, but you may understand for the first time why. And that understanding, Lacan would say, is the closest thing to freedom we get. There was a moment, you will not remember it, but it shaped everything when you first saw yourself. Not in the way you see yourself now, with the habitual glance, the checking, the small adjustments. Before all of that, before the story you built around the face, before the name had fully settled into the body, before you knew in any coherent sense that you were a you at all, you were an infant, held up before a mirror. And something happened. Lacan calls it the mirror stage. He described it in 1936, and it remains one of the most quietly devastating ideas in the history of thought. Not because it is complicated, but because once you understand it, you cannot unlearn it. It gets into the foundation. It rewrites what you thought you knew about the thing you call yourself. Here is what happened in front of that mirror. You saw a form, coherent, unified, complete at the edges, a body that held together, that had a shape that appeared from the outside whole, and you recognized it as you. It felt like discovery. It felt like arrival. It felt, in whatever wordless way an infant feels anything like this is what I am. But here is what Lacan understood that you didn't, that no infant ever does, because the understanding requires a distance that infancy cannot hold. The image was a lie, not a malicious lie, not a cruel one, a structural lie, the kind of untruth that is built into the very conditions of perception, because you, the actual you, the uncoordinated, fragmented, overwhelmed, sensation-flooded bundle of impulses that you were nothing like that image. Inside there was no coherence, no clean edges, no unified form. There was chaos, there was need, there was hunger without language and sensation without shape, and a body that did not know itself from the outside world. But the mirror said, "You are whole," and you believed it. And that belief, that moment of identification with an image that was always slightly outside you, always slightly other, became the template for everything that followed. This is the wound that is not a wound, the theft that is not a theft, the loss you never noticed because it was taken before you had words to register the taking. What was lost was not something you possessed. What was lost was the truth of your own incompleteness, replaced instantly and irreversibly by an image of wholeness that you would spend the rest of your life trying to live up to inhabit, to finally fully become. The ego, what Lacan calls the moi, the I that you present to yourself and others, was built on that image. It was not discovered. It was constructed. A fiction assembled around a reflection, a self fashioned from the outside in, borrowed from the mirror, from the gaze of the mother, from the faces that looked at you and told you wordlessly, "This is what you are." You have been trying to fill that image ever since. Every achievement, every love, every moment of recognition, of being seen, of being valued by another pair of eyes, underneath it, the same ancient motion. Am I the one in the mirror? Am I finally whole? Does what I see from the outside match what I cannot feel from within? It never quite does. Because here's the thing about that mirror image. It was always other. Even when it was called you, it was not you, not the living, breathing, tumbling incoherence of what you actually are. It was a representation, a still frame, and the gap between what you are and what you appear to be, between the felt experience of being inside this life and the image of yourself you carry, does not close with time. It does not close with success. It does not close with love. Though love comes the closest, though love is where you most desperately want it to close, though love is precisely where the gap becomes both most visible and most unbearable. You look at someone who loves you and you think, if they knew, if they could see inside the mirror rather than at it, if they could feel what it is be me rather than to behold me. This is not neurosis. This is not damage. This is the human condition, Lacanian edition. The self was built on an alienation that is as old as the self. And so the first layer of desire is this. You desire wholeness. You desire the image. You desire to finally completely inhabit the body in the mirror and feel, not just appear, unified, complete, arrived. You look for it in work, in recognition, in the eyes of someone who loves you specifically, who finds you specifically, who seems to see past the performance and land somewhere true. But the mirror was always external. The image was always other, and the wholeness it promised was always a promise the mirror could make, but never keep, because it was never describing something you lost. It was describing something that was never structurally available. The gap is not a wound you could heal. It is the distance between being a subject and appearing as one, between the inside and the outside of a life, between what you are and what you see when you look. This is not the end of the story. This is the beginning of it, because out of that gap, out of that founding alienation, that first and irrevocable loss, desire is born, not in spite of the gap, because of it, Desire is what fills the space between who you are and who the mirror said you were. It is the motion toward wholeness in a being who was never whole to begin with. You do not desire because you are lacking something specific. You desire because you are lack. Because at the root of personhood there is an absence that no object, no love, no achievement will ever permanently address, and yet which every love, every achievement, every burning wanting in the middle of the night is trying in its way to answer. The hunger has a history. It began before language, before memory, before you knew enough to know you were lost. It began in front of a mirror that told you the most beautiful lie you have ever been told. You are whole. You have been searching for evidence ever since. Before language, you were everything. Not everything in the grand sense. Not cosmic, not infinite, not divine. Everything in the only sense that matters to an infant. Undivided. The hunger and the warmth and the darkness and the voice and the skin. All of it, one continuous field of sensation. No border between the self and the world. No edge where you ended and not you began. Pure immersion. Pure being. Then someone gave you a word, and the world split in two. This is not a metaphor, or rather it is the metaphor that contains all others, the one beneath the others, the fall that is not punishment but structure, not tragedy, but the irrevocable cost of becoming human. The moment language entered you, something was lost, not gradually, not partially, completely, permanently, in the very same instant that the world became nameable. Think about what a word actually does. You reach for something, warmth, presence, the specific gravity of being held, and someone calls it mother, and now it has a name, and the name is not the thing. The name is a sound, a symbol, a mark in the air, or on a page that stands for the thing but is not it, can never be it, sits always at one remove from the living reality it claims to represent. Every word is a glass case. Every name is a distance. Every sentence you have ever spoken about your experience has been, at the same time, a translation away from that experience, useful, necessary, the only way we have to reach each other, but always at its root, a small betrayal. The thing was real, the word is a ghost of the thing, and you have been living, since the moment language came for you, in a world of ghosts. This is what Lacan means by the symbolic order. The vast architecture of language, law, culture, sign, symbol, the whole inherited system of meaning you were born into before you could consent to it. The symbolic is not something you learned, it is something you were submerged in, shaped by, constituted inside of, the way water shapes the fish, without the fish ever deciding to live in water. You did not acquire language. Language acquired you, and in acquiring you, it did something to you that cannot be undone. It inserted you into a chain of meaning, of words pointing to other words, of symbols referring to other symbols, that never bottoms out in the thing itself. You want to say love, and you know, somewhere beneath the saying of it, that the word falls short. You want to say grief, and you feel the word buckle under the weight of what it's being asked to carry. You want to say I, the simplest, most fundamental word, and you sense, if you press on it even slightly, that it refers to something you cannot quite locate, something that was never as solid as its one-letter certainty suggests. The symbolic gives you the world and takes the real world away. Desire lives in this gap. Lacan is precise about this, almost mathematical, which is strange for someone whose subject is the ache of being alive. But the precision matters. Desire, for Lacan, is not simply wanting something. It is not appetite. Appetite can be satisfied. The hunger answered by food, the thirst answered by water. Desire is structurally different. Desire is what lives in the space between need and demand. Follow this carefully, because this is where it gets true. Need is biological, the body's requirement. Hunger, warmth, contact, needs can, in principle, be met. Demand is what happens to need when it passes through language, when the infant cannot simply receive warmth, but must ask for it, must cry, must gesture, must eventually use words. In that asking, something shifts. The demand is never only for the thing. It is for proof of love, for presence, for being chosen. The infant who asks to be held is not only asking for the physical fact of arms, It is asking, am I wanted? Am I the one you would reach for? And desire is what remains after the demand is answered. The thing is given, the holding happens, the need is met. But the wanting, the deeper wanting, the wanting that was never really about warmth or milk or arms, but about something that cannot be named, that the demand was always only pointing toward, that wanting remains, untouched by satisfaction, unmoved by arrival. Because what desire truly wants cannot be given. It cannot be given because it cannot be named. And it cannot be named because it existed before language, in that lost country before the word came and divided the world in two, in the place of pure being that you will spend your entire life trying to return to and never reach. Because the very act of reaching for it, of naming what you want, of putting your desire into words so that another person can understand it, takes you further from it. You speak your longing, and the longing recedes. You name your need, and the naming is already a distance. There is a way that lovers know this without knowing it. You lie with someone you love, truly love, not the performance of love, but the thing itself, the rare and disorienting reality of another person becoming necessary to your existence, and there are moments when language fails completely. When you look at them and feel something that has no word, that the word love is too small to carry, that every sentence you might form dissolves before it reaches the air. And in that silence, something close to the original is present, something pre-linguistic, something from before the split. But you cannot stay there. The moment passes. Language returns, as it always returns, because you are a subject inside the symbolic, and there is no permanent exit. You say something, the something is approximate, the gap reopens, and the wanting begins again. This is why Lacan says that desire is always the desire for something else. Not this object, but the one beyond it. Not this word, but the one that would finally perfectly say the thing. Not this love, but the love that would reach past language into the pre-linguistic warmth, the original fullness, the before. Every desire carries inside it the ghost of that first loss, the loss of the real, the loss of the undivided, the loss of the world before the word came and split the sky cleanly. In two, this and not this, self and other, named and unnameable. You are not searching for a person, though it feels like a person. You are not searching for a feeling, though it arrives as a feeling. You are searching for the thing the word was supposed to deliver and didn't, for the country that existed before you were given its name, for the ground beneath language, beneath self, beneath the long civilized architecture of meaning you were handed at birth. You are searching for the real, and the searching, Lacan would tell you, is endless. Not because you're insufficient, because language is, there is something about a particular person that undoes you, not everything about them, not the reasonable sum of their qualities, their intelligence, their kindness, the life they have built, the values they hold. Those things matter, those things are real, but they are not the thing. They are not what catches in you like a hook and refuses to release. They are not what wakes you at 2 a.m, not with a thought exactly, more with a pressure, a wordless gravitational pull toward a specific human being that no amount of rational accounting can fully explain. What undoes you is smaller than that, more precise, more strange, the way they turn their head when something surprises them, the particular quality of their voice in the morning, before the day has fully assembled itself around them, the laugh that escapes when they are not performing, when something genuinely catches them off guard, and for a second they forget to be careful, forget to manage how they appear, and something unguarded moves through them like light through a gap in a curtain. That, just that, you could be with them for years and still feel it, that specific thing, that particular quality, still catching, still hooking, still producing in you a wanting that feels disproportionate to its object, that feels, if you examine it honestly, less like a response to a person and more like a response to something the person is carrying, something they may not even know they carry. You call it love, you call it attraction, you call it this person specifically out of all the people in the world. Lacan calls it the objet petit, and it is the most important thing he ever said. Let us be slow with this. It deserves slowness, the name first, because the name is doing real work. The A is from the French autre, other, small other, petit autre, as distinct from the big other, the grand capital O other, which is the symbolic order itself, the whole architecture of language and law and culture that constitutes the world you were born into. The object petit is not that, it is not grand, it is precise. It is small in the way that the detail that ruins you is always small, not the painting but the brushstroke, not the symphony but the four-note phrase that breaks you open every time. And it is not, Lacan insists, the object of desire. This is the distinction that changes everything, and it is worth sitting with until it settles. The object of desire is the thing you think you want, the person, the relationship, the feeling of being loved by this specific human being in this specific way. When you say I want them, the object of your desire appears to be them, the whole person, the full human being standing in front of you with their life and their history and their particular way of existing in the world. But the object petit a is not that. It is the cause of desire, the thing that sets desire in motion, not the destination, but the engine, not the beloved, but the hook in the beloved, the small, inexplicable, almost accidental quality that ignites something in you that then gets projected outward onto the whole person, so that the whole person seems to shimmer with a significance that, if you are honest, is not quite theirs. The significance is yours. The shimmer is yours. You put it there. Understand what this means. Not coldly, not as a diminishment of love or a reduction of the beloved to a screen for your projections. Understand it as Lacan intends it, as a map of desire's actual territory, which is always, finally, interior. When you fell, when the floor dropped away and the world reorganized itself around a face, a voice, a laugh escaping through a gap in a curtain, what happened was not that you found someone who possessed a quality you lacked. What happened was that you recognized in them the precise shape of your own constitutive incompleteness, the gap that the mirror installed, the loss that language deepened, the specific, unrepeatable form of the missing piece that you have been carrying since before you had words to know you were carrying it. The object petit a is that missing piece, externalized, projected, perceived as if by natural law, as if by the world's own declaration, in the face and body and particular small gestures of the person you love. You are not reaching toward them. You are reaching toward yourself, toward the part of yourself that was declared missing in the long process of becoming a subject, in the mirror's lie, in language's loss, in the whole civilizing history of being made into a person. And when you look at the one you love and feel that specific pull, that particular voltage, what you're feeling is the nearness of the missing piece, the sense that the gap is about to close, that wholeness, the wholeness the mirror promised, the wholeness language took away, is finally at last within reach. This is why falling in love feels like recognition, not the recognition of someone new, something far stranger, the recognition of something you already knew, something you had been carrying so long in such darkness that you had stopped knowing you were carrying it, and then this person appeared, and they had it, or seemed to have it, or more precisely, more Lacanianly, they were wearing it, carrying it for you, holding your own lack up to the light so that you could finally see its shape. The Romantics knew this, felt it, gave it every beautiful name they could find. Plato gave it to Aristophanes, the myth of the original humans, spherical and complete, cut in two by the gods and condemned to wander the earth, searching for the other half that would restore them to wholeness. We find this myth beautiful because it captures something true about the phenomenology of falling in love, the sense of finally this is the one, this is what I was missing, this is the completion I didn't know I was incomplete without. Lacan finds it clarifying for a different reason, because if the Aristophanes myth is right about the feeling, if falling in love really does feel like recovering a lost half, then it is also, Lacan would say, right about the structure. You are looking for a missing piece. You are trying to recover something lost, but the myth gets the location wrong. The missing piece is not in another person. It was never in another person. It is in you, or rather, it is constitutively not in you, which amounts to the same thing. It is the gap at your center. the absence that desire is built on, and the beloved is not its location but its occasion, the particular arrangement of qualities that, in your specific and unrepeatable way, happens to rhyme with the shape of what is missing. This is not a betrayal of love, it is love's deepest truth. And here is where it becomes almost unbearable, because the objet petit cannot be possessed. Not because it is too rare, or the beloved withholds it, or because you're unworthy of it. It cannot be possessed because it is not, in truth, in them. It is a projection. It is your own lack wearing their face, and the structural law of projection is that proximity dissolves it. Draw close enough, let the extraordinary become ordinary, let the unknowable become known, let the charged distance of longing collapse into the daily, embodied morning breath reality of two people sharing a life, and the shimmer migrates, not from them to someone else, necessarily, not always, not inevitably, not as a sentence, but it moves, the charge shifts, the hook loosens. The specific quality that caught you, you can still identify it, still catalogue it, still point to it and say that is the thing, but it no longer produces in you what it once produced. It no longer opens the depth. It no longer feels like the edge of a world, and you wonder with a guilt too tender to confess to anyone what happened, whether something was lost, whether you loved less well or wanted less truly, whether the fault is yours or theirs or simply time's Lacan would say, none of these. The objet petit moved because it always moves, because it was never a stable property of the beloved, because desire is not a state but a motion, always toward, always reaching, always one step ahead of the arrival that would end it. The shimmer migrated not because love failed, but because desire is structurally incompatible with permanence. Desire requires the gap, and the gap requires distance, and the distance is exactly what love, over time, with extraordinary tenderness and persistence and courage, love closes the distance. Desire needs the distance. This is the tension at the heart of every long love, not a tragedy. A structure, a thing to be known, not feared. A thing to be worked with, not surrendered to. There is one more thing to say about the objet petit before we move into the territory that follows from it, and it is the most vertiginous thing, the thing that requires you to hold two contradictory truths at once without letting either one collapse into the other. The objet petit is not outside you. It was never outside you. Lacan's term for it is the remainder, what is left over, what falls away, what doesn't make it through the process of becoming a subject inside language and law. When the mirror did its work and language did its work, and you emerged from childhood as a coherent self, a person with a name and a face and a story and a reasonably stable sense of who you are, something was lost in that emergence, some quantum of the original fullness, some residue of the pre-linguistic, pre-divided, pre-named existence that was yours before the symbolic order claimed you. That residue crystallizes into what Lacan calls the objet petit et it is not a thing in the world. It is not findable, locatable, acquirable. It is the ghost of what was lost when you became a person. And it is what desire is always underneath all its specific objects and particular beloveds and named wants, actually reaching for the return to wholeness, the recovery of the remainder, the closing of the gap that was opened when the mirror lied and language killed the thing, and you entered the long, necessary, irreversible exile of selfhood. You carry it inside you. You see it outside you. You pursue it in every wanting. And the pursuing, the motion itself, the reaching, the forward lean of a soul that has not yet arrived and cannot stop trying, is what Lacan, in his precise and unsentimental way, recognizes as the very substance of a human life, not the arrival, the motion toward, not the having, the wanting. And the wanting, as we are about to discover, has a shadow side, a place where it crosses a threshold and becomes something else, something that no longer simply aches but burns, something that is no longer simply desire but its violent, ecstatic, self-consuming excess, something Lacan calls jouissance, and it will require everything we have built so far to understand it. There is a pleasure that does not feel like pleasure. You know it. You have been inside it. It is not the clean pleasure of satisfaction of thirst met by water, of tiredness met by sleep, of a question met by its true answer. It is older than that. Stranger, it lives in a different part of the body, or maybe beneath the body, in the place where the body meets something it cannot name. It is the pleasure that costs something. The pleasure that you return to, even knowing it will cost you. The relationship you couldn't leave, even as it dismantled you. The grief you held on to longer than grief required, because grief had become, somehow, a form of closeness. The love you kept choosing, even as it made you smaller, not because you were weak, not because you didn't know better, but because the pain of it had become indistinguishable from the feeling of being alive, the suffering that had become, quietly, without your consent, a form of home. Lacan calls this jouissance, and it is the most honest word in his entire vocabulary. The translation matters, and it resists translation. The French jouissance carries inside it both enjoyment and orgasm pleasure, and its extremity, satisfaction, and its overflow. In English, we reach for enjoyment or bliss, but both fall short, because jouissance is not simply intense pleasure, it is pleasure that has crossed a threshold, pleasure that has tipped over into its opposite, and discovered on the other side that the opposite was always already inside it. It is the pleasure that hurts, the hurt that pleasures, the place where the two become indistinguishable, and you find yourself wanting the wanting even when the wanting is destroying you. Here is the structure of it. Desire, as we have seen, lives in lack. It moves. It reaches. It is always the desire for something else, something beyond, something that the current object is only pointing toward. Desire is essentially dissatisfied, and that dissatisfaction is not its failure, but its engine. Desire needs the gap to be desire. Jouissance is what happens when you try to close the gap by force, when you push past the symbolic limit, past the law, past the boundary, past the socially sanctioned form of wanting, and into the raw, ungoverned territory of absolute satisfaction. When you say, consciously or not, I will have this completely, I will consume this entirely, I will close the distance between me and this thing, this person, this feeling, until nothing remains between us. The body says yes, the psyche pays the price, because what lives in absolute satisfaction, in the place beyond ordinary pleasure, beyond the regulated economy of wanting and getting and wanting again, is not peace. It is not the sunlit meadow. It is something closer to dissolution, to the loss of the self that was built on lack, to the obliteration of the subject who desired, because desire requires distance and jouissance annihilates distance, and in that annihilation something essential to your coherence as a person is temporarily destroyed. This is why the French use the same word for orgasm and for the mystical experience of union with the divine. At the extreme of pleasure, the self disappears. And the self, it turns out, was what you were most afraid to lose. Think about the way it works in love. You love someone, truly, not manageably, love in the mode that reorganizes everything, that makes you strange to yourself, that opens in you a depth you didn't know was there. And in that love, there is a particular quality of wanting that is not comfortable, that is almost too much. That tips, in certain moments, into something that resembles suffering. Not because anything is wrong, not because the love is unrequited or the person is cruel, but because the wanting itself has become so intense that it is indistinguishable from pain. You want to be closer, and somehow closer than physical proximity allows. You want to dissolve the last membrane between you, to get inside them, not sexually but ontologically, to finally fully cross the gap that the mirror and the word installed, to recover the original warmth, the undivided, the before, and you can't. The gap remains, the other person remains other. No amount of closeness eliminates the fundamental separateness of two subjects. And the wanting intensifies precisely because it cannot be satisfied, which means the wanting approaches jouissance, approaches that threshold where pleasure tips into pain, where the desire to merge becomes almost an aggression toward the beloved for their irreducible otherness, for their refusal simply by being a separate person to be the thing you need them to be. This is not pathology. This is love at its most honest. But here is where it becomes important, where Lacan becomes not just true but urgent. Jouissance is not only the ecstasy of love, it is also the engine of self-destruction. There are people, and you may have been one in some chapter of your life, who return again and again to what harms them, not out of ignorance. They know. They can see the pattern from the outside. They can describe it clearly and accurately in the light of morning. And then the evening comes and they choose it again. The relationship that diminishes them, the thought pattern that spirals, the wound they keep pressing. From the outside, this looks like a failure of will, a lack of self-knowledge, a masochism that wants explaining. From inside Lacan's framework, it looks like something else entirely. It looks like the person has found, in their suffering, something that functions as jouissance, something that fills, temporarily, corrosively, at enormous cost, the gap that ordinary pleasure cannot touch. Their pain has become their most intense form of being alive. Their suffering has organized itself into a kind of home. And the familiar suffering, however destructive, feels more real, more densely, viscerally real, than the quieter, healthier alternatives that don't reach into the same depth. To leave the suffering would be to lose the jouissance. And the jouissance, for all its cost, is the closest they have ever come to the feeling of being fully inhabited, of existing at the maximum intensity, of not being numb. This is what Lacan calls the enjoyment of the symptom. The symptom, whatever it is, the pattern that repeats, the wound that won't close, the behavior that harms you, the love you return to knowing how it ends, is not simply a malfunction. It is a solution, a costly, self-defeating, ultimately insufficient solution, but a solution nonetheless. It is the psyche's way of managing the gap, of answering the intolerable pressure of lack, of getting, in the only way it has found available, a form of the satisfaction it cannot reach any other way. You don't repeat the painful pattern because you want to suffer. You repeat it because inside the suffering there is something that feels, to the deepest part of you, like a rival. And love. Love is the place where jouissance is most nakedly present, most unavoidable, most structurally built in. Because love is the relationship in which you most clearly see the objet petit projected onto another person, in which you most urgently want to close the gap, in which the other person's irreducible otherness, the fact that they remain, no matter how close you get, a separate subject with a separate interiority you can never fully know, becomes the source of simultaneous ecstasy and anguish. You love them. You cannot have them. Not completely, not in the way desire is asking for. And that impossibility, that remaining distance, that gap that love cannot close, is exactly what makes the love feel like love. Take the gap away, fully satisfy the want, and what remains is not love at its height, but love in its aftermath. Comfortable, real, possible, but no longer charged with that particular voltage of jouissance. Love needs the impossibility. Desire needs what it cannot have. And jouissance is what you feel in the place where those two truths meet and burn. There is a question that follows from all of this. The question you are probably already holding. If jouissance is this, the pleasure that costs you, the pain that you return to, the suffering organized into a kind of home, then what do you do with it? Is the answer to refuse it? To become moderate? To stay within the economy of ordinary desire? To never approach the threshold where pleasure tips into its other side? Lacan does not say this. He says something harder. He says, recognize it, not cure it, not transcend it. Recognize it in yourself, in your patterns, in the specific, unrepeatable shape of your own jouissance. See what it is costing you. See what it is giving you. See the bargain you have been making, maybe for years, maybe for your whole life, maybe without ever having a word for it. The recognition will not eliminate the wanting, but it will change your relationship to it. And changing your relationship to it, not curing it, not resolving it, but understanding it clearly enough to no longer be entirely its captive, is what Lacan means in the end, by the analytic work, not to stop wanting, to know what you are wanting and why and at what cost, and to choose, with open eyes, how much of it you are willing to pay. There is a question underneath every question you have ever asked, not the question you spoke aloud, not the question you brought to a conversation, to a relationship, to the long interior argument you have with yourself in the hours when sleep won't come. Underneath all of those, underneath the practical questions and the philosophical ones, and the ones that feel too exposed to say to another person, there is a single question, ancient, unanswerable, the question that, if you are honest, has been running beneath your life like a current beneath a river, invisible from the surface, shaping everything. What do you want from me? Not your question to another person, though you have asked it, have felt it pressing against the inside of your ribs in relationships, in families, in the particular exhaustion of trying to be what someone needs without ever being told what that is. The question as it comes from the other, directed at you. What do you want? Chez vous. Lacan borrows this phrase from a story. A young man makes a deal with the devil, gets everything he wished for, all his desires fulfilled, and then turns to the devil and asks, unsettled despite the fulfillment, uneasy in the midst of getting exactly what he wanted, "But what do you really want from me? What is the desire beneath the transaction? What is being asked of me that hasn't been spoken?" Lacan takes this moment and makes it the center of his theory of subjectivity. Because this precise unease, this feeling that behind every exchange, every relationship, every system of meaning you have been inserted into, there is a want directed at you that you cannot fully read, is not paranoia. It is structure. It is the condition of being a subject inside the symbolic order, inside language, inside a world that was already there before you arrived and had already decided before you could consent what you would be called and what you would be expected to become. You were born into a desire that was not yours. Stay with this. Let it unfold slowly, because it is easy to hear this and move past it before it has had time to land, before you existed, before you were anything other than a possibility, a hope, a fear, a projection. People were already wanting things from you. Your parents, not only your parents, the family, the culture, the religion, the language, the whole vast apparatus of the symbolic order that preceded you by centuries and would outlast you by centuries more. All of it already had a shape prepared for you, already had a name waiting, already had desires, spoken and unspoken, conscious and unconscious, reasonable and impossible, aimed at the space you were about to occupy. You arrived into a field of wanting, and your first task before you could speak, before you could walk, before you had any coherent sense of yourself as a self, was to try to read it, to try to decode what was wanted from you, to become, as best you could, the answer to a question that was never fully articulated, directed at you by people who were themselves often not fully aware of what they were asking. The mother who needed you to be happy because her own unhappiness was unbearable. The father who needed you to succeed because his own failure was unprocessed. The family that needed you to carry a dream, a wound, a legacy, a redemption that had nothing to do with who you actually were and everything to do with what they needed you to be. You learned to read these desires the way you learned to breathe, without instruction, without awareness that you were doing it. Just survival. Just, this is what the field requires of me, and I will become it, because becoming it means remaining inside the warmth, remaining loved, remaining safe. And somewhere in that becoming, somewhere in the long, largely unconscious process of shaping yourself to the desire of the other, you lost track of what you yourself wanted, or discovered, in the most disorienting way, that you were not sure the two things were different. This is what Lacan means by the big other. Not a person, not God, though it can take on a godlike function. Not any specific individual, though individuals can occupy its position. The other, capital O, is the symbolic order itself. The whole system of language, law, meaning social expectation, cultural inheritance that constitutes the world you were born into. It is the field you were inserted into before you had a self. It is what spoke you before you could speak. It is what desired you before you knew how to desire. And the fundamental question of human subjectivity, the question underneath every other question, the question that desire is always in some form trying to answer is, What does the other want from me? Che vuoi? Think about the shape this takes in an ordinary life. You are good at something. You have been told you are good at it since you were small. A skill, a quality, an aptitude, something that produced reliably a specific response in the people around you, approval, recognition, the particular warmth of being seen and valued. And so you cultivated it, you built around it. You became, over years and decades, a person for whom this thing was central, not simply because you loved it, though you may have come to love it, but because it was the most reliable way you found of answering the desire of the other, of becoming briefly, clearly, the right answer to the question that was always being directed at you. But underneath the skill, underneath the achievement, underneath the whole carefully constructed presentation of self, there is a question you have never been able to fully silence. Is this what I want, or is this what I learned to want because it was what was wanted of me? And the difficulty, the specifically Lacanian difficulty, is that you cannot always tell, because the desire of the other gets inside you early, before you have the equipment to distinguish it from your own desire. It shapes your wanting from the inside. It becomes, in many cases, indistinguishable from what you genuinely, authentically, originally want. You perform and achieve and love and build and sometimes destroy, and underneath all of it, the old motion, trying to decode what someone else wants from you, trying to become the answer to a question you can hear but never quite make out, trying to satisfy a desire that is not yours but that has lived inside you so long it has the texture and the weight of something native. In love, this becomes the most exposed, because love is the relationship in which the desire of the other is most directly at stake, in which you are most nakedly asking, not always in words, sometimes only in the quality of your attention, in the way you adjust yourself in someone's presence, in the specific anxiety that rises when they are unhappy or distant or suddenly unreadable. What do you want from me? Not what do you want in general. What do you want from me, specifically? What am I to you? What is the desire that you are directing at me? What is the shape of the want that I am supposed to fill, and am I filling it? And if I'm not filling it, what must I become in order to fill it? And if I cannot become that thing, will I still be wanted? And if I am not wanted, what remains? Love makes the che vuoi unbearable, because love is where the stakes of being wanted are highest, where the terror of not being wanted, of failing to be the right answer to the other's desire, is most acute. And so you perform, not cynically, not with full awareness. You perform in the way that all subjects perform for the other, which is to say, you inhabit the role that seems to be required. You present the self that seems most likely to satisfy the want directed at you. You adjust and modulate and calibrate yourself to the desire you're trying to read. And in the middle of all this performing, in the middle of this exhausting, unconscious, fundamentally loving attempt to become what someone needs, you lose track, again, of something. Not dramatically, quietly. The way you lose a word, it was there, you knew it, and then it was simply gone, and the absence is more disorienting than the loss of anything you could name. You lose track of your own desire. Lacan has a term for the self that emerges from this process. He calls it the subject of the signifier, the self that is constituted inside language, inside the symbolic, inside the field of the other's desire. And the tragedy, if it is a tragedy, Lacan himself was never quite sure it deserved the word, is that this subject is always, by definition, alienated from itself. Because the other's desire was there first, because language was there first, because the system of meaning you were inserted into preceded you, and will outlast you, and has never at any point been fully yours. You are a subject constituted inside a desire that was not originally your own. And the question that analysis is supposed to open, not answer, because answering would be another form of the other's desire telling you who to be, is, underneath everything that was wanted of you, underneath the skill, the role, the performance, the long history of trying to become the right answer to the question you couldn't fully hear, is there a wanting that is yours, not the desire of the other, internalized and mistaken for your own, not the wanting shaped by the mirror's lie or language's loss, not the jouissance of the symptom or the shimmer of the objet petit, but something prior to all of that, some original orientation toward the world, some native direction of desire, some way that you specifically lean into existence that belongs to you before the symbolic claimed you. Lacan is not certain this exists. He is certain the question is worth asking, because here is what happens when you stop asking it. When you stop asking, "What do I want?" and only ask, "What is wanted of me?" When the desire of the other becomes so total, so pervasive, so indistinguishable from your own desire that the distinction collapses, something occurs that is not dramatic and is not loud, and does not arrive with the force of a crisis. It arrives as a flatness, a quality of going through the motions, of doing the things that are expected, and done well and met with approval, and feeling, underneath the approval, underneath the performance, underneath the reliable satisfaction of being the right answer to the other's question, a kind of hollowness, a sense that the life being lived is adjacent to the life that is yours, that somewhere in the gap between what was wanted of you and what you originally wanted, a self went quiet, not disappeared, quiet, still there, still oriented, still leaning in its original and unrepeatable way toward something, but buried under the long, faithful, exhausting labor of being what the other desired. Psychoanalysis for Lacan is not the process of satisfying desire. It is not the process of becoming whole, of filling the gap, of resolving the fundamental lack at the center of subjectivity into a comfortable and sustainable peace. It is the process of learning to ask the question the other has been drowning out. Not "what do you want from me?" but slowly, with difficulty, against the full weight of a lifetime of performing for a desire that was never yours. What do I want? Not as an answer. Lacan distrusts answers. Answers are too easily the other's voice wearing the costume of your own, as a practice, as a sustained, humble, rigorously honest engagement with the wanting that lives in you when you stop trying to satisfy anyone else's, as the beginning, not the completion, not the resolution, but the beginning of a life that is, in some essential way, your own. We have come a long way inside this. We began in the deflation, that quiet, unsettling moment after you got what you wanted, and found it wasn't quite what you had wanted. We walked through the mirror that lied and the word that killed the thing and the shimmer that migrated always one step ahead of possession. We went into jouissance, the pleasure that burns, the suffering organized into a kind of home. We sat with the question that the other has been directing at you your whole life, and the quieter, harder question that lives underneath it. And now we are here, at the place where all of this has been pointing, not toward resolution. Lacan does not offer resolution, not toward the sunlit meadow of fulfilled desire, the final satisfaction, the arrival that ends the journey. He never pretended those were available. What he offers is something stranger, and in the end more sustaining than any of those. He offers a different relationship to the wanting itself. Let us be honest about where we are. If everything we have traced is true, if desire is constitutively unsatisfied, if the gap cannot be closed, if the object petit always migrates, if jouissance costs more than it delivers, if the other's desire has been shaping your wanting from the inside, since before you had the equipment to notice, then the obvious question is, what now? What do you do with a life built on a gap that cannot be filled? How do you live well inside a structure that guarantees you will never fully arrive? How do you love without being destroyed by the impossibility of merger, pursue without being consumed by the endlessness of the pursuit, want without being hollowed out by the wanting? This is not a rhetorical question. This is the question, the one that Lacan's entire body of work circles without quite landing on, because landing on it would be to offer the kind of answer that the other gives, clean, directive, satisfying in a way that desire, real desire, is never quite satisfied. So instead, he circles, he approaches from different angles, he refuses the comfortable resolution, and in that refusal, something true becomes visible. Begin here. The wanting is not the problem. Read that again, not as consolation, not as the kind of reframe a self-help book offers when it tells you to embrace the journey in a tone that has never actually sat with the darkness of the journey, as a structural claim, a philosophical position, one that follows with genuine rigor from everything Lacan observed about the nature of desire, The wanting is not a symptom of something that went wrong. It is the evidence that you are alive, not alive in the biological sense, the heart beating, the lungs filling, the body metabolizing its way through another day. Alive in the sense that matters more than that, alive in the sense of oriented, of leaning, of having a direction, a tilt, a forward pull that means something in the world is still calling to you. That the gap at your center has not been sealed over by habit or despair, or the particular exhaustion of a life lived entirely in the service of the other's desire. The wanting means the self is still present, still reaching, still in its unrepeatable and inarticulate way, insisting on itself. Think about what the alternative looks like. Not the absence of suffering. That would be relief, and relief is not nothing. Relief is real and worth pursuing. The alternative to wanting is not peace. It is not the clean, open spaciousness of a mind at rest. The alternative to wanting in Lacan's framework is something closer to psychosis. The foreclosure of desire, the collapse of the gap, the dissolution of the very structure that makes subjectivity possible, because desire requires a gap, and the gap requires a subject who is at a distance from the fullness they reach for. And that distance, that constitutive incompleteness, that founding lack, is not the wound in an otherwise whole person. It is the condition of personhood itself. To close the gap entirely would not be satisfaction. It would be the end of the self that was doing the wanting. You have glimpsed this in Jouissance, in those moments where pleasure pushed past its own threshold, and the self briefly dissolved, and the dissolution was both ecstatic and terrifying. The terror was real, the self recognized in the annihilation of the gap, the annihilation of itself, and pulled back, returned to lack, returned to desire, returned to the ache that, for all its cost, was at least the ache of someone who exists. The wanting is not the obstacle to your life, it is the proof of it. But there is a way of wanting that destroys, and a way of wanting that creates, and the difference between them is not the wanting itself, not the depth of the desire, not its object, not its intensity, but the relationship you bring to it. There is a wanting that cannot tolerate its own incompleteness. That takes the structural unsatisfiability of desire as a personal affront. That says, consciously or not, in words or in the shape of a life, I will not rest until I arrive, I will not be at peace until the gap is closed, I will not accept this ache as anything other than a problem to be solved, and I will keep solving, keep acquiring, keep pursuing, keep demanding satisfaction from objects and people and achievements that are structurally incapable of providing it. This wanting is desire at war with its own nature. It is the wanting that cannot want, that can only grasp, consume, discard, and move on. That mistakes the migration of the object petit for a failure of the last object rather than a feature of desire itself. That keeps expecting arrival and keeps being devastated by the deflation, and in the devastation cannot find what the deflation is actually showing. And then there is a wanting that knows what it is, that has looked at the structure, at the mirror and the word and the gap and the shimmer that migrates, and has made not peace exactly, but a kind of accommodation, an honest reckoning, a decision to want with open eyes rather than against the truth of wanting. This is the wanting that creates, that makes things, that loves things, that stays in the work, not because the work will deliver final satisfaction, but because the work is where the wanting lives most cleanly, most productively, most in alignment with the shape of the self that is doing it. Lacan talks about something he calls traversing the fundamental fantasy. It sounds abstract. It is one of his most practical ideas. The fundamental fantasy is the story you tell yourself about the objet petit, the unconscious conviction that somewhere, in some person or achievement or arrival, the gap will finally close, that the missing piece exists in the world, findable, acquirable, capable of completing you. It is the fantasy that organizes desire from underneath, that shapes which objects you pursue, which relationships you enter, which horizons you lean toward, which forms of jouissance you return to even knowing the cost. Traversing the fantasy does not mean destroying it. It does not mean waking up one morning and deciding, by an act of will, to stop believing in the possibility of wholeness. Desire doesn't work that way. The unconscious doesn't work that way. You cannot simply choose to stop reaching. Traversing the fantasy means seeing it clearly enough that it no longer has you entirely. Means recognizing, not once, not as a revelation that settles the matter, but again and again in the ongoing practice of a life examined, that the shimmer is yours, that the missing piece is yours, that the object you are pursuing is not the cause of your desire, but its occasion, that the wanting is not going to end when you get the thing, because the wanting was never really about the thing. And in that recognition, in that slow, difficult, never quite complete act of seeing, something shifts. Not the wanting remains, but the suffering that comes from expecting the wanting to end, from measuring every arrival against the fantasy of final arrival and finding it insufficient. That suffering loosens its grip, slightly, unevenly, not forever, but enough to breathe. There is a figure Lacan returns to, not directly but by implication, that I want to bring here. Sisyphus, you know him. The man condemned by the gods to roll his boulder up the hill for eternity, reaching the summit, watching it roll back, beginning again, forever, without arrival, without the rest that arrival would bring. The punishment is designed to be the cruelest possible, not pain exactly, not suffering exactly, but the perpetual denial of completion, the eternal approach and eternal return. The wanting that cannot end because the having is structurally withheld. Camus famously said we must imagine Sisyphus happy. Lacan would say something slightly different. Lacan would say Sisyphus is us, not as punishment, as description, as the most honest map available of what it is to be a desiring subject inside a structure that guarantees perpetual incompleteness. The boulder is not the problem. The hill is not the problem. The rolling is not the punishment. The punishment, the only real punishment, would be to stop, to lie down at the bottom of the hill and decide that because arrival is impossible, the rolling is meaningless. To let the gap close not through satisfaction, but through resignation. To stop wanting because the wanting has never delivered and will never deliver what you most want it to. That, the death of desire, the sealing over of the gap, the self that has stopped reaching, that is the suffering Lacan is most concerned with. Not the ache of wanting, the numbness of having stopped. And in love, which is where this all becomes most personal, most urgent, most impossible to keep at a philosophical distance, the invitation is the same. To love, knowing it will not close the gap. To love, knowing the objet petit will migrate, that the beloved is not the missing piece, but the occasion for recognizing the missing piece. To love, knowing that the merger you most want is structurally impossible, that the other person will remain irreducibly other, that the gap between two subjects cannot be permanently bridged, no matter how close the love brings you. To love anyway, not in spite of this, not by ignoring it, not by maintaining the fantasy that this time with this person, it will be different, that this love will be the one that finally answers the want in the way no love has yet managed, but with open eyes, knowing what you're doing and why you're doing it, knowing that the wanting will outlast the having, that the shimmer will migrate, that the jouissance will cost you, that the question che vuoi will never be fully answered, and choosing in full knowledge with clear sight against the seduction of the fantasy and the comfort of the illusion to want anyway, to reach anyway, to love this specific, irreducibly other, impossibly themselves person, not because they complete you, but because the wanting of them is the shape your aliveness currently takes. This is not resignation. Do not mistake it for resignation. Resignation says, I cannot have what I want, so I will stop wanting. I will lower my desire to match what is available. I will make my peace by making myself smaller. This is the opposite of that. This says, I know what wanting is, I know its structure, I know its cost and its drift and its constitutive incompleteness. And I choose it. I choose the ache over the numbness. I choose the reaching over the stillness. I choose to live in the forward lean, in the not yet, in the beautiful and terrible motion of a desire that knows it will never finally arrive and goes on anyway. Because the going on is the life, not the destination, not the arrival, Not the moment the gap closes and the wanting ends and you finally, lastly, rest the going on. The wanting, the boulder and the hill, and the beginning again. Lacan never promises you satisfaction. He promises you something rarer. The possibility of a desire that is yours, that knows itself, that moves through the world with open eyes, rather than the closed eyes of fantasy, that can want without the wanting being entirely at the mercy of the other's desire. The mirror's lie, the objet petit's beautiful and perpetual migration. A desire that is, finally, in whatever incomplete and ongoing and never quite settled sense, yours, not cured, not satisfied, yours. And that in a life that began with the mirror's lie and passed through language's loss, and discovered at the center of love the impossibility that desire has always been built on. That is not nothing. That is, perhaps everything. You are still here. After everything. After the mirror and the word and the shimmer that wouldn't stay still. After the pleasure that cost you and the question you couldn't stop trying to answer. After the long reckoning with a desire that was never going to deliver what you most wanted it to deliver, you are still here, still wanting, still reaching, still, in whatever quiet or turbulent way the current moment allows, leaning forward into a life that has not yet fully revealed itself. Notice that, not as achievement, not as something you earned by staying awake through the difficulty of all this. Just notice it. The wanting is still present, the gap is still there, and you're still oriented towards something, still pulled in some direction, still alive in the only way that finally matters. You have not stopped. There is a word in Arabic, shawk. It does not translate cleanly. It never does. The words that carry the most. It means longing. Yes, but not the longing of simple absence, not the longing of someone who merely lacks a thing and wishes they had it. Shawk is the longing that is itself a form of presence, the ache that contains within the aching a quality of aliveness that the satisfied person does not possess. It is what the Sufi poets felt when they wrote about the beloved, not the grief of separation only, but the strange paradoxical fullness of the separation itself. The way the longing proves the love, the way the reaching proves the reality of what is reached for. Ibn Arabi understood this. Rumi understood this. They were not Lacanians. They were speaking from inside a completely different tradition, a completely different relationship to desire and its object. But they arrived at something structurally similar, which perhaps tells us something important, that this truth is not theoretical. It is not the invention of a French psychoanalyst working in mid-20th century Paris. It is older than that. It is in the bones of human experience, in the poetry written in every language across every century by people who sat with the ache long enough to discover what it was made of. The longing is not the opposite of arrival. The longing is its own form of arrival. The wanting is not the failure to have. The wanting is a way of having, of being in intimate, continuous, alive relation with the thing that calls to you, even across the distance that can never fully close. Think about what you have loved most in your life, not what you have possessed, not what you have acquired or achieved or successfully obtained. What you have loved in the mode of genuine, irreducible, surprising love, the kind that reorganized something in you, that made you different just by virtue of its presence in your life. The music that opened a room in you that you didn't know was there. The book that found you at exactly the right moment and said the thing you had been trying to say to yourself for years without the words. The place, a light at a certain hour, a landscape, a particular quality of morning air in a city that felt inexplicably like home. The person whose existence in the world made your existence feel more possible, more inhabited, more worth the trouble of being. Did you possess any of these? Did you have them in the way that having finally settles the wanting? Or did you have them in the other way, the deeper way, the way of being perpetually called toward them, of returning to them again and again, not because the previous return was insufficient, but because each return opened something new, revealed something unnoticed, deepened rather than exhausted the wanting? The music does not run out. The book yields differently at 40 than it did at 20. The landscape shifts with the light and the season, and the person you have become since you last stood inside it. the love, the real love, the kind that has survived time and disappointment, and the migration of the objet petit, and the cost of jouissance, and the long, humbling work of loving another person as they actually are, rather than as you need them to be, deepens. Does not satisfy in the sense of ending, deepens, which is another word for the gap becoming more spacious, more inhabited, more capable of holding the complexity of two people who have chosen, again and again, the impossible and necessary work of wanting each other. This is the beautiful wound, the gap that does not close but becomes, over time, your own. Lacan is not a poet. He would probably resist this final turn, the softening, the image, the reaching towards something that sounds uncomfortably like consolation. He was suspicious of consolation. He thought most of what passes for psychological health is simply the ego's latest way of avoiding the truth of its own constitutive incompleteness. But I think he would allow this much. The wound is real. The lack is real. The gap at the center of selfhood, installed by the mirror, deepened by language, kept alive by the endless migration of the objet petit, is not a metaphor. It is not a poetic way of describing ordinary unhappiness. It is the structure of subjectivity. It is what it is to be a person inside language, inside a body, inside the long and irreversible history of having been made into a self. And it is beautiful. Not in the easy sense, not beautiful the way we call beautiful what is merely pleasant, what causes no friction, what sits lightly on the surface of experience and asks nothing difficult of us. Beautiful in the hard sense, the old sense. The sense the Greeks meant when they said something was kalos, beautiful and good and worth preserving, precisely because of what it costs, precisely because of the difficulty it carries inside it. The wound is beautiful because it is the wound of someone who has wanted, who has reached, who has loved specific people and specific things and specific qualities of light at specific hours with a specificity that no one else could replicate, because the shape of your lack is yours alone, and the shape of your desire follows from it, and the whole unrepeatable trajectory of your wanting, everything you have reached for and not quite had, everything that caught you like a hook and then migrated, everything you loved knowing it would cost you, is the most accurate map of who you are that exists anywhere. More accurate than your name, more accurate than your history, more accurate than anything you could say about yourself in the clear light of a reasonable afternoon. The wanting is you. The gap is yours. The wound is beautiful because it is the wound of a life that has not stopped. So here is what I want to leave you with. Not an answer. Lacan would not forgive an answer, not a resolution, not a technique, not a set of steps toward a more enlightened relationship with your own desire. Those are the other's gift, and you have spent enough of your life trying to satisfy the other. Just this. The next time the deflation comes, and it will come, it always comes. The quiet settling after the arrival, the atmospheric disappointment of getting what you wanted and finding the wanting has already moved on. Do not be afraid of it. It is not evidence of your brokenness, it is evidence of your aliveness. The next time the shimmer migrates, when the charge shifts and the hook loosens and the specific quality that undid you no longer produces in you what it once produced, do not take it as failure. Of you, of them, of love, it is desire doing what desire does, moving, reaching, insisting on the next horizon. The next time jouissance catches you, when the pleasure tips into pain and you find yourself returning to what costs you, when the suffering has become a form of home, sit with the question underneath it. Not with judgment, not with the demand that you immediately change, with honest curiosity. What am I reaching for here? What gap is this trying to close? What original warmth? What lost fullness? What remainder of the before is this wanting trying, at whatever cost, to recover? The question will not solve it, but it will make you less entirely its captive. And the next time someone asks something of you, with words or with their eyes, or with the simple, enormous, unspoken pressure of their need, and you feel the old motion begin, the familiar reaching for the shape that will answer their desire and make you briefly the right answer to the question, pause and ask underneath it, quietly, without demand for a clear response, what do I want? Not what has been wanted of you, not what the mirror suggested, not what the word can reach, what you want in the deepest, most honest, most inarticulate register you can access. In the place before performance and before the symbolic, and before the long civilizing history of becoming the person you were shaped to become, the answer will not be clean. It will not arrive fully formed and settle the matter once and for all. It will be partial, flickering, more a direction than a destination, but it will be yours, and a desire that is yours, that knows itself, that moves with open eyes, that has made its honest reckoning with the gap and chosen to reach anyway, is not a solved life. It is not a happy life, necessarily, in the way that word is usually meant. It is something better than happy. It is inhabited. It is real. It is the life that belongs to you, rather than to the desire that was directed at you before you arrived, the life that carries at its centre the wound that cannot close, the gap that will not fill, the want that will not end. The beautiful wound. Wear it. Not with pride, not with performance, with the quiet, steady, undeceived recognition that it is the most honest thing about you, that it is, finally, indistinguishably, you.